So I want to talk about uh, proposed epistemology, drawing especially on the work of David C. Schindler, on one that privileges truth as understood and the act of understanding as understood dramatically in the notion or the nature of drama. Uh, so officially, I've entitled this Mediation and the Dramatic Structure of Truth. Um, And hopefully, what this would do is resolve, maybe not the best word, but certainly illuminate the apparent opposition between continuity and discontinuity, intellect and will, phenomena and noumena, and in some ways, above all, Meno's paradox, which is Plato's classic dialogue, um, or drawn from the Meno, his dialogue on the apparent conflict between the fact that if we knew what we come to know, then there would be no such thing as coming to know something because we already would have known it. Whereas if if you don't have any idea what you want to know, then it would seem as though there's no possibility to know anything. That's not the best description of it, but essentially, this epistemology would illuminate what Plato is trying to put his finger on as what seems to be a paradox. There's various attempts to identify a non-egocentric basis for knowledge, such as tradition or language, but these both still, in a sense, privilege the priority of identity over difference, and therefore lack that dramatic structure that he wants to propose. So you can understand truth itself and not just reason as having a dramatic structure, as having a sort of dynamic relation between two hierarchically related poles where the tension is not removed, but uh, comprehensively transcended and included or embraced by a whole that's greater than either pole or the sum of their parts. So one of the aspects of drama that he wants to connect to this epistemology is action. So the will is related to knowledge. It's not a purely passive mode, certainly. Um, so like all drama, it's constituted by action in some sense, but at the same time, it's not any kind of voluntarism where it creates, the will creates out of nothing. It's always, giving body to or interpreting something that is already given. Uh, Now, if you don't have this kind of tension between those two poles, you can fall into one side or the other. So he talks about how, with Descartes, who is sort of the arc rationalist, um, interestingly enough, actually describes the possibility of error as such, which is something he's very interested in, as coming from the fact that the will is much wider in its range than the understanding. And when it's not restrained within the same bonds, but unduly extended to things the intellect does not understand, then that is the basis for all error, and not just intellectual error, but moral error, etc. Um, Now Aquinas talks about how, once again, this apparent dialectic of intellect and will is a kind of infinite regress, because if the if the intellect apprehends something it only does so because of the receptive movement of the will. But at the same time, the will cannot make that motion without being proposed, without having something proposed to the intellect. So to bring Schindler's proposal into some dialogue with some other thinkers, Cyril Regan talks about how Schindler does acknowledge Heidegger's view of truth as aletheia, where the disclosure is always held back by some degree of non-disclosure, which is itself kind of a dramatic structure of that tension of continuity and discontinuity, and in which the self is knowing, embodied, and willing as a subject, ecstatically responding to the disclosure of truth. So this already kind of discounts any kind of view from nowhere type of epistemology, certainly. And then Schindler draws a good deal on Plato as well for how the dialogues exemplify a kind of dramatic structure by embodying the nature of, for example, the virtue that's under discussion. So in the Charmides, Justin Clark's article talks about how the way of understanding the self and what is good and bad for the self is core to what temperance is in this dialogue. But that investigation is dramatically woven into the fabric of the dialogue itself, where Charmides comes in, all the interlocutors kind of lose themselves in their passion and in a distraction, and then Socrates is able to reflect upon his own temptation to losing control, and then bring that into the dialogue itself, as opposed to trying to understand something from a purely extrinsic or abstract way. So when it comes to Kant, Schindler has some interesting thoughts on how Kant's critical philosophy essentially exhausts the subject's conditions of possible experience prior to any encounter with what lies outside the subject. So this would be the reverse of what the Platonic dialogues are pointing toward, in a sense. Whereas in Kant, the soul, which had once been the place of the forms, now is sort of, in a Procrustean sense, constrained by what it can understand a priori, which has to be intelligible to it. Whereas anything beyond those conditions simply cannot be received or perceived. And Schindler connects this to a kind of loneliness as constitutive of the mind in Kant's thought. In a way, it's cut off from the really real. And this, in some sense, is nothing new as far as a critique of Kant's critiques. But he connects it to his proposal for a dramatic structure to epistemology in a few different ways. So in Kant, the world is not ultimately even something that is understood, but a kind of occasion for the means for understanding. And even this sort of, he calls it incidental contribution to knowledge from outside the knower, the subject, is absent at the level beyond the senses. So there Kant talks about the sublime, but even there, it can't be encountered, anywhere fully within the world. So for this reason, Kant kind of famously rejects any sort of revealed religion in any ultimate sense, because everyone has their own understanding of God, which has to fit the a priori categories of thought, and therefore any revealed religion is valuable only instrumentally, insofar as it helps direct the mind toward natural religion, so to speak. So Schindler mentions, how Hegel, in his critique of Kant, talks about how the horizon, the barrier of the phenomena from the noumena, like any horizon, can only exist in relation to what lies beyond it, and its limits are, defined by what is beyond. So Schindler acknowledges, Kant's point about the necessity for the a priori categories of understanding, but thinks that he draws that barrier too tightly because it's of the nature of a limit, as he says, to not have the final say. And so you can see here how revelation is fulfilling a key part of the role of drama in the sense of unexpected and yet fulfilling surprise. And Schindler notes how grace often is experienced with a certain irony. So Schindler talks about how the act of understanding itself collapses the distinction between spontaneity, receptive, and receptivity, because it's receiving and understanding the Gestalt by indwelling it, which simultaneously means moving in a willing way beyond its previous state or understanding or its preconceived expectations. So once again, you can see the dramatic aspect there. So regarding Balthasar's kind of famous analogy of the mother's smile drawing forth the smile from the child's what he calls the return gift of its freedom, as Schindler writes, is its kind of mirroring reception of the mother's smile. So it's not as though it's a spontaneous movement from nowhere, but at the same time, it is a willing action, or at least analogously in the case of an infant. The fact that the return smile of the child is, in a way, part of the understanding of the mother's initial smile. So the ecstatic moment of action, so to speak, is intrinsically part of the understanding itself. So you can see the will and the intellect here once again being kind of interpenetrating. But the interesting thing is that if, as he says, as Balthasar proposes, the spontaneous activity of consciousness, this is the quote, i.e., the child's initial human act, his smile, arises as a gift in the reception of his mother's initiating act, then surprise is, as it were, built into the very heart of consciousness. The receptivity that allows for the free response of the smile is itself a prior gift. So the very possibility for the dramatic response is also given. And Schindler connects this to Meno's paradox, where the soul anticipates its object, but because the object is beyond soul's capacity to understand from within itself, when it does encounter the object, it is simultaneously fulfilled and surprised. And Schindler describes this not as an exceptional act, but actually revealing the fundamental structure of cognition itself in its normal everyday operation. And he notes that this is not merely an intellectual engagement, but incorporates the volitional, perceptive, affective dimensions of the self. And then he connects this to Balthasar's sequence in his trilogy, where you first experience the beauty of a form that calls forth a response, and then the will contributes to an action and decision. And then finally, that would be the good. And then finally, the true is the unveiling of the meaning of the whole, he calls it, which is simultaneously anticipated and yet also a surprising fulfillment. And because that which is disclosed to the subject also passes through a kind of trial of dramatic action that calls forth a response, it's described by Balthasar not only as disclosure, but also as a kind of fidelity and trustworthiness, or imeth in Hebrew, which he describes as bringing together the Greek and Jewish traditions here. On the other hand, Schindler mentions how even though this shows forth the structure of reason, it's not reducible to reason, because that movement requires the irreducible other. So within the natural order, this would be the object of reason, in the supernatural order, the priority of faith. And thus, in every act of understanding, there's a kind of analogous approximation of the act of faith. And therefore, being surprised by faith is actually a perfection of the nature of reason. So Schindler affirms a kind of intrinsic discontinuity within the structure and act of reason itself, which is not a threat to it. Because in order for the mind to take hold of something else, it has to let go of itself, in a sense. So the appetitive, desiring aspects of the will are fundamental to reason in coming to know that which is outside the mind. And so you can think of Plato here with Eros as connected to reason, and philosophy as beginning in wonder, and the drama of the surprise. But all of these are not, Schindler points out, just instigations for reason to get going, but part of the completion of reason itself. To the degree that reason aims to understand something, its aim is directed at an object in some sense other than itself and transcendent of it. So there's a degree, Schindler says, of self-transcendence required of reason in all of its acts, even the most basic ones. And that such transcendence has as part of it a moment of discontinuity and therefore gratuity. So in that sense, the encounter with revelation is not just a limit beyond which reason becomes faith, but approximated in all of reason's acts. And it's not something you can settle after we understand what reason is in a purely immanent sense, but it's part of the nature of reason, whether it's the natural self-disclosure of the world or the revelation of God in history.